So you showed them your serum level of glucose and your A1C.
Yeah.
You achieved better control than you ever had,
Yep.
and they were discouraging you from doing the method as opposed to paying attention to the results in front of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much for joining me today. I have a very, very special guest today. His name is Ryan Attar. And we got put together because a little while ago I came up with what I thought was an incredibly advanced new idea about insulin. And I talked to Professor Bart Kay in New Zealand, and he gently burst my bubble and told me it's not a unique idea because it's something that someone's come up with already. And that's when he introduced Ryan to myself. And he's got an incredibly unique story. I think it's fascinating. And what I would suggest to you viewers is even if you don't have diabetes, Ryan is absolutely worth listening to because what you will learn from looking at his story and what he's learnt about insulin and diabetes should change your perspective in terms of how insulin actually acts in your body every time you eat food. So, Ryan, thank you very much for joining me today. It's a privilege. I think
Th-
you've got a
th- Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. But really appreciate that. And yeah, and I'm glad you had insight about insulin. And a lot of people do, and it's sad because it's not the standard of care for diabetics. And yeah, I'm living proof that it should be.
Yeah, exactly. I think what would be really good is to give a little bit of context as to how you came across the, shall we say, discoveries that you've made. Could you give us a little bit of background in terms of you were in the army and things didn't
Yeah.
quite go according to plan, shall we say? Could you give us a little bit of info on that?
Yeah, so yeah, I never thought I'd be working in healthcare or medicine, and I was in the army. Went in the army after university, and spent my whole time in the army overseas. I spent a year in Iraq, and then 4 years I was stationed in Germany. And while I was in Germany, came down with type 1 diabetes and had the typical newly diagnosis symptoms. I lost a lot of weight. My normal weight is about 170 pounds, and I was down to 130. So I was really
Wow.
skinny, and I was incredibly thirsty and peeing quite a lot, like every hour. I go to the bathroom. Um, and I also noticed I didn't, connect this until after the diagnosis and I'd kind of processed everything. But when I go to the bathroom, I noticed it smelled sweet. The name diabetes mellitus, it means the basically flowing of honey. That's where the name comes from. And yeah, so because when your blood sugars get to a certain threshold, the kidneys start spilling out the glucose and into your urine, and that's what I was smelling in my urine, grossly as that sounds. So yeah, I got diagnosed. I had spent 5 years in, and after the diagnosis, had about another year, and you're essentially not fit for duty if you're a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah,
Not that kind of physically I can't do anything, and I'm because I'm very active and do all kinds of things in the fitness world. But yeah, you're not fit for duty if you were to have to deploy. You have to keep your insulin refrigerated. You have to have access to that insulin and test. It's you're kind of a liability to yourself and your fellow soldiers. So yeah, you're not fit for duty. And I was medically discharged, and I got out and you know followed the standard of care for a while. And I remember initially talking to my doctors and going over diet, which is a very, very small part of the treatment plan with endocrinologists and diabetics. Um,
unfortunately.
yeah, and you know, going over like I would take my insulin initially, and okay, you're gonna whatever carbs that you're eating, you're gonna count them up, and you're gonna take this amount of insulin to balance that off. And everything was about carbs and insulin. And I was into diet or nutrition, but I ate generally healthy back then. And I'm also very disciplined with food, and I think that goes back to when I was a kid and all through my teens. I was a wrestler. And
Okay.
wrestling, one thing about wrestling, especially in the USA, is cutting weight and
Hmm.
making your weight class. And so as a kid and teen, probably pushed it a little too far. I was a pretty competitive wrestler, and was always cutting my weight to hit my weight class, right? And so I'm very disciplined. I was eating like during the wrestling season in high school, eating like 500 calories a day, and
Wow.
watching all my friends, in the cafeteria eating their lunches, and I'm just eating something really small. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm very disciplined when it comes to diet. Not, and not that was a good thing of me restricting my diet while I'm growing and all that. Um, but I have discipline, and so if someone tells me you need to eat this way to be healthy, I can do it. I don't have any qualms about changing and doing. I'm not tied to a diet for any other reasons. I'll do whatever I need to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, these doctors talking to me, talking about carbs and insulin. I'm like, oh, you want me to just not eat those carbs? And if the doctor said right then, yes, then yes, I would have done that right there, and I would have, from the start, been off to a good start.
Yeah.
And she said, no, you you need those carbs, and it won't do you any good to cut them. And I was like, okay, you're the doctor, you're the expert, and that's what I did for a year or two to 3 years after that diagnosis and initial treatment. But then I started figuring things out and reading about health and nutrition and diabetes. And um, strangely, a gym got me, not strangely, because I think gyms are a lot of where people go for their health. And
Yeah.
personal trainers end up being the person that a lot of people will go to before a doctor, just because that's who they have access to and that's who they talk to. And I went to a CrossFit gym in 2010, before it was even a big thing.
Yeah.
Um, and this gym was way ahead of the curve, and had a paleo diet challenge for a month, and it turned out to be a low carb ketogenic paleo diet. And the owner of the gym was pitching this month challenge to the gym, and he was like, it's great for weight loss, it's great for diabetes, and I'm like, I'm a diabetic, it's not going to help me. I have to take insulin. He's like, well, why don't you give it a try and see? And I did, and it was the first time I just cut out carbs,
Yeah.
and my blood sugars were amazing. And I was told at that point, why aren't more people doing this?
Yeah.
Now, there's a bit more to managing type 1 diabetes than just cutting out the carbs. It's not
Sure.
it's not a cure for type 1 diabetes. I'm insulin dependent for life, and so it
Yeah.
took me some time after that to kind of find, how, even though my numbers did improve considerably, it took me some time to figure out the correct way of doing that, and that's Dr. Bernstein's method. Dr.
Yeah.
Bernstein is a type 1 diabetic who last month turned 90 years old. He
Wow.
was diagnosed in like 1945 or something like that. Like, he should not be alive. Type
Yeah.
1s diagnosed back then, their life expectancy was there in the 40s and 50s, and like not to 90. So, his method is a very low carb method, and he's got a lot of specific ways to manage insulin as well. So, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And after a while, you would think, hey, this is a different method. Maybe a lot of people just won't do this, and
Yeah.
that's a problem in medicine. You could give someone the best plan for their health, and maybe they won't follow that.
Yeah.
But I'm someone that's ready to do that, and so I would go back to my doctors with these great results, with great blood sugars, and they weren't even curious. They weren't even curious as to, hey, how are you doing this? I want to share this with other patients. Or they were even discouraging, and I've had doctors tell me, you need to get your A1C up. It's too low, even though it's not low. It's normal. It's where a normal insulin sensitive healthy person would be.
So you showed them your serum level of glucose and your A1C.
Yeah.
You achieved better control than you ever had,
Yeah.
and they were discouraging you from doing the method as opposed to paying attention to the results in front of them.
Yeah, exactly. So they would see that and to achieve that, I'm having lows, and it's just not the case. Um, because well, I didn't have a way to prove it then, because it's just a finger stick meter, and I could show them like, look, I don't have very many lows at all. But they just assumed, hey, if you have that A1C, the only way to achieve that is that you're going low. And then even after A1Cs came about, would show them this, and then that you'll hear other excuses for not you're eating too much saturated fat, you're eating too much protein, you're going to destroy your kidneys, all these myths that we hear. So I got to a point and I was just frustrated with this, and I had after you serve in the military, you can basically get your school paid for, your university paid for in the USA. So I still had that to use, and so it's called the GI Bill. I was like, let's go back to school. And initially I wanted to be a nutritionist. I went to do a master's in human nutrition, and my school, we have a profession called naturopathic physician and ND here in the USA. My school had that program. I didn't even know what the profession was before, but I since the military is paying for it, I tacked that on, and I've been in practice ever since 2017.
Fantastic. So,
Yeah.
with all that story, I'm intrigued. The first time you were told, okay, you're type 1 diabetic, obviously that was when you were still in the military.
Yeah.
Could you give us an idea of what your diet was like at the time of you getting that diagnosis?
Um, I'd say a typical, well, actually, I wouldn't say a typical American diet, because I was living in Germany. I'd spent 4 years in Germany. So I was, Europeans tend to eat a lot healthier than Americans. And so, I was exposed to that and kind of immersed in it. And so I remember sitting down with I think they had referred me to a dietitian at this point, and they're going over my diet, and they're like, "What do you have for breakfast?" And I said I had some uh, some eggs, a bagel, and some coffee with cream. And they're like, "Okay, you should try to do, if you're going to do eggs, try to do some egg whites instead. You have like one whole egg and a couple egg whites. Instead of cream in your coffee, put skim milk in your coffee." Um, and I was
Sounds
like,
like they were
okay,
trying to reduce the fat intake. Would that be
that's
fair to say?
yeah, and that's still to this day a big push from dietitians and endocrinologists is cut saturated fat out of your diet as a diabetic. And Yeah, unfortunately, that's not going to help me, and just the opposite. And I'm not someone that there's a lot of people who eat a low carb diet that eat a very high fat um, low carb keto diet, and I my diet is very protein focused, and I eat protein until I'm full and satiated, and I eat the fat that goes along with that protein. So I'm not like putting half a stick of butter in my coffee or things like that. I eat the fat that goes along with those foods, those low carb foods that I'm eating, and I find it works best, keeping me lean, and it works best, keeping me, insulin sensitive, which you can excessively eat fat and start to get a little insulin sensitive, and not that I want anyone fearing fat, but
Yeah, of
I feel
course.
a good way to go about it is eat the fat that goes along with your food and don't add fat to things.
Yeah,
And that's a pretty good strategy that works for most.
absolutely.
But
And
yeah,
when
I mean,
you,
I was eating pretty typical. I wasn't restricting carbs at all,
okay,
and um, yeah, so I'd say typical European diet at that time.
sure. And so I guess, you talked about when you went to that CrossFit gym and they had that challenge. Was that the first time you considered reducing carb intake since your diagnosis?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, across the board with diabetics, even those that aren't on board with a low carb diet, you're almost always going to see people choosing like a diet cola, or um, if there's an easy swap out like that, surprisingly, someone that's totally against a low carb diet, then why are you doing why don't you have a sugary Coke then? But so things like that, yeah, I would have cut them out. But no, I hadn't really attempted to remove any, and hadn't kind of pondered it enough to think that there would have been a benefit, and my doctors also weren't suggesting it or advising it or even giving me that option.
Yeah. And so when you did that challenge in that gym, could you give us an idea of what you felt that was different once you made that change in diet in that month? As it physically, how did you feel? What did you notice that was different about yourself, if anything?
Um, I would say well, just starting in 2010, I was getting in really good shape, and so I was having a lot of positive, health benefits from that. Um, Starting the diet, I did just feel overall better. The thing that kind of blew my mind was would have a protein meal, and well, first would go low, have a low blood sugar after the meal, and then I'm realizing, oh, okay, I need less insulin, and then I just incorrectly just didn't take insulin for my protein meals, and I had decent blood sugars after, but not normal and non-diabetic blood sugars. But to me, seeing this the in the past, type 1 diabetics have this roller coaster ride up and down of their blood sugars. To me, I'm like, wow, I don't need insulin because I'm staying, and this certain level. And also in the first years after you get diagnosed, you still have some beta cell function, so blood sugars will come down a little bit on their own. So I was seeing some of that. Didn't realize at the time that I didn't need it. I needed a little extra insulin, but yeah, that's what I noticed was just, wow, blood sugars are so much easier
Yeah.
to control, and I need a lot less insulin.
Amazing. Amazing. I know
Yeah,
that must have been a real light bulb moment for you. And I
yeah,
think what's fascinating for me is how you went from that moment where you discovered this change was happening within you to thinking about the profile of insulin, the pharmacokinetic profile of insulin. What put you on a path that made you think, because I'm eating different, why am I using the same standard type of insulin? Because to pretty much everyone watching this, there's just insulin and that's it. You inject it
yeah.
and you're done. There's no such thing as different types of insulin. How did you go down that road?
It was finding Bernstein's method and reading his book, and even reading it the first time, he was talking about this older insulin that the one I use for my meals. It's called regular insulin, R insulin, and it's an older insulin. And if anyone watching has been a diabetic for a while, it was the only insulin available 20, 30 years ago. That was all you had available. People don't like that because it's a milder insulin. It's a milder insulin that is less potent and lasts a little bit longer too. So, if I were to kind of draw the kind of action of the normal mealtime rapid insulins, it's a steep peak, right? That like that. The regular insulin is a milder, longer peak. If you eat some protein, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you eat a huge protein meal, don't take insulin, it's that same mild peak. It's like a 2 to 3 hour, 2 to 4 hour even mild spike. Um, Now, yeah, yeah, and if you take now, if someone doesn't have access to this insulin, there are ways to kind of split it, and to split the dosing and taking smaller dosing at different times to stabilize that spike. Um, but if you were to just take insulin for that protein meal like you do for a carb meal, what's going to happen is that rapid insulin is going to spike your blood sugar down because it's acting faster than the food. And then, as the food starts digesting and your blood sugar starts coming up, um, the protein's still going to be digesting, and the insulin's wearing off, and you're going to have a higher blood sugar 2 to 4 hours later. And yeah, a lot of people see that when they initially cut carbs out and they don't change their insulin strategies. And it's very, very common in the type 1 world to see that happen, and there's just not enough info out there unless you find Burns folks following Bernstein's method and promoting his method. So yeah, that's how I kind of discovered using that insulin. In the USA here, it's really easy to get that insulin. Surprisingly, you hear we have all these issues with expensive insulin. Walmart sells regular insulin over the counter, no prescription needed. And yeah, the Walmart's pharmacy is actually kind of good like that because they have a lot of customers that don't have insurance, and so they have a lot of very cheap, low price medications in general, and they have regular insulin for those that don't have a doctor or don't have insurance, and it's cheap. It's like a box of our insulin pens from Walmart here. It is like 40 or $50, and
Wow, that's not
that'll
bad.
that'll last me 3-4 months.
Wow. Okay.
Um, and I know because I've talked to type 1s in the UK, it's harder to get. You have to find a doctor that will prescribe it, and
Yeah.
they don't understand what's why someone would want to use this older insulin, and they'll have a tough time getting it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's a really, really important part of the management,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's unfortunately not discussed enough. So refresh my memory of the idea you had about insulin.
Yeah. So my idea was essentially to take the insulin molecule and then essentially create different versions, different esters perhaps, or something along those lines, so there's a different half-life. So once it's injected, it gets active, if you like, at different rates based on what it's bonded to. And
Mm,
I thought, depending on different diets that people have, so someone was to have, let's take extreme examples. If someone has just like a big tub of ice cream, obviously you're going to get a massive sort of peak like this in the sugar. If someone was to have just a typical meal that you are going to have, which is probably some steak with all the fat around the side, the sugar increase is not going to be like this. It's going to be more like we said, like a speed bump. And so my idea was based on what meal you're having, use a different type of insulin that's bonded to something different to affect the way it's becoming active once it's injected. But obviously, I was beaten to it, which I'm
yeah.
not bothered about. I think the
Well,
fact
I
that
know. I think. Well, I think your idea is something that is being worked on as well.
okay,
There is. I don't know. I don't know how close they are to being out. Probably, in the type 1 world, there's always these things on the horizon that never come about. But there is supposedly going to be insulin that's sensitive to the blood sugar that activates when you get to a certain threshold. It sounds like that would be great. My worry is going to be that threshold is going to be high, like a higher threshold, because the big fear of lows. The We see the same thing happening with insulin pumps now. So because insulin pumps have automatic features right now, these closed loop systems, these artificial pancreas, basically. The problem is all the commercially available pumps have about I'm using the American units, about 100 to 120 milligram per deciliter target range, which is elevated, and good numbers for a lot of type 1s because they have much higher numbers, but those are not what a normal non-diabetic use. But I actually use a pump. I have an Omnipod here, and I'm using kind of an aftermarket software called Loop, and Loop you can target truly normal blood sugars, and so about 80 milligrams per deciliter, 4.4 millimole, and you can target that with Loop, and I do that. It's not a FDA approved app here, so you have to do a few little tricks to get it on your phone. But once you do, and you have to use the older Omnipod, I have the Omnipod Dash for anyone that knows what these are. Use the older Omnipod, and then you can get this app and do that. And that's what I use. But yeah, unfortunately, the trend is to target higher blood sugars that are, first easier for those systems to manage, and then also it's just safer, in their mind, safer to keep you higher than have a low that could potentially be dangerous in the short run. Um, and also, I'm using this So type 1 diabetics, we use two insulins. We use a basal long-acting insulin that takes care of our, the glucose that our body's making all day long, whether we eat or not.
Hmm.
And then we have our mealtime insulin. My
Yeah,
my pump is just doing that long-acting basal insulin, and
sure, because
I'm
you got
doing
no
separate.
sugar in your meal.
Well, I'm still taking the mealtime insulin, but I use that regular insulin in a pen separately from
Ah,
this.
okay,
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Interesting. So, in terms of that particular pump, is there two reservoirs normally, so you can have the two different types?
No, no. So pumps work like this. Instead of that long acting insulin. So normally there's a couple long acting insulins out there. Lantus, Triceba are the popular ones. And you take them once. Sometimes it works better to take twice a day, and they last throughout the day and cover all that. Pumps work differently. Pumps only have the rapid insulin in it, and it gives you little microdoses of the rapid insulin throughout the day to simulate that effect. And it's actually better to do that, because when you do the long acting insulin injections, you're getting one shot in kind of one rate throughout the day. But naturally, a human being has different basal insulin needs throughout the day. Their blood sugars, you be higher in the morning, maybe lower midday, and you'll have your needs change throughout the day. With the pump, you can have changes minute by minute even. With the injections, you're kind of, you just get that one rate, and then you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
And you can make blood sugars like mine, A1Cs like mine work with, and I've done it with injections and with pumps. I'm not putting injections down, but pumps are better for managing the basal like that. Yeah.
Wow. So you actually trust the pump to do just as good, if not a better job, than you doing things manually.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So there are some limitations to the pump. Um, this pump is really good. I've used pumps in the past that will get occlusions, and you'll have problems with insulin. I've literally never had that happen once. People do with these Omnipods, but I've that's not happened for me ever. Um, and other problems, you have to be careful about moving the pumps around. So I change this every 2 or 3 days. I move it around my body, because if sometimes type ones will wear their pump on one spot for like months and years even, and you'll start getting scar tissue and fat at that spot. You'll get a you'll get fat buildup right at that site, and you're insulin resistant more at that site. So it's important to rotate that around. The other the other thing, so a pump like this, it can run that basal rate, and you could set whatever rate you want it, and then tweak that as you kind of get your numbers closer to normal. What this pump does in that Loop app is it talks to my continuous glucose monitor. It talks to my CGM and can make settings adjust. You can adjust those settings on top of that to make your numbers even better, and then has safety features where if you start trending low, it can turn that off to prevent lows, um, which is a great feature, an amazing feature. One limitation, though, is CGMs can fail. CGMs can give some, especially if you're dehydrated. If you sleep on top of your sensor, they can throw it off. And so it's important to not, have 100% trust in these devices, and to always, do a finger stick to verify if numbers are off, and yeah, but yeah, they're a great tool, but they're not perfect, and still require a little bit of work on our part, which is
I
which
agree.
is fine. Yeah,
Yeah, I think CGMs, technically they're not actually measuring blood levels, are they? They're measuring interstitial levels. And
exactly.
there is going to be a little bit of delay. For instance, sometimes when you're in the shower and you've got a lot of hot water and heat in that tissue, it's going to register as having a much higher glucose level because there's more blood flow in that area. Do you
Yep.
find that the system you have, incidents like that, like when you're having a hot shower, actually throw things off a little and confuse the pump perhaps?
Yeah. Even more so, dehydration can will cause that interstitium which is mostly water, to
Yeah,
be more dehydrated. So if you have less water in the interstitium, it's going to make it look like a higher concentration of glucose. So it's important to stay really well hydrated.
yeah,
And I'm a big fan of electrolytes and
same.
salt, and so if you're on a low carb diet, it's a really important thing, and often not talked about enough. And a lot of people, just like diabetics going on a low carb diet and not changing their insulin, a lot of
Yeah,
just non-diabetics will go on a low carb diet and not realize they need more salt,
yeah,
and have all the brain fog and achy muscles and poor sleep and things that go along with that.
sure.
So staying hydrated and keeping your electrolytes balance is really important for that CGM reading correctly. Yeah.
100%. Would you mind, because I know a lot of people will be interested, which in particular, is there any particular type of salt or CGM or electrolytes that you
Yep.
personally are using now and that you prefer?
I use Element, and I think they're great. If they're too expensive, because they can be a little pricey, but um, it's their electrolytes are really easy to make on your own. And even the guys who made Element, they're from the keto gains community. They have recipes on their website on how to make your own. Like they're really passionate about the low carb diet and making sure electrolytes are used properly. And they're like, look, if you don't buy Element, here's how to make it. And you can get salt at any grocery store, but it's fairly easy to get potassium salt too. They sell like light salt mixtures, and so you can make up your own and then add whatever kind of water flavoring you want to make it taste a little less salty. Some people don't mind just the salt in their water if you kind of dilute it enough, but if it does, you could definitely add the kind of zero cal water flavorings to balance that off. And yeah, but otherwise, yeah, I use Element.
Sure. And what about salt? Is there any particular salt that you prefer on your food?
Um, I have a mix, and like I like the pink salt and the sea salt. It tastes a little nicer, but
Yeah.
I do use iodized salt, and
Okay.
I often find these days I'll test people's iodine and it's low, because
Yeah.
they don't have a lot of dietary sources of iodine, and they're using pink salt or sea salt thinking it's healthier, and then they have no
No
dietary
iodine.
sources of iodine.
Yeah.
Do they iodize the salt in the UK as well?
Some do, some don't. It's a mix.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, unless you're eating like sea vegetables and shellfish, it's tough to get enough iodine.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do use iodized salt for that
Fine. And
reason.
then, and what about CGM? Obviously, your CGM has to work with your insulin pump. So I'm intrigued, which particular one do you use that is compatible with your pump?
So I'm using the Dexcom G7,
Okay.
and G7 is their newest model, and it had been getting poor reviews for a while when it came out. It was having some Bluetooth errors and accuracy errors. They've and because of that, I had only recently switched to the G7. I was using the previous model. It seemed to be a little more reliable, but they've ironed out those problems. And if you get a G7 now, they're very accurate, and they work really well. And there's, if anyone listening is using Dexcom G7, you can look online. There's ways to see if you have the revised models of those of the G7, and if you have any problems, Dexcom's good about replacing sensors that are giving you those old years with the new model. The other major brand is the Libre, and the I haven't used it myself, but I've had patients that have used the Libre 2 and the Libre 3. The Libre 2 has some accuracy problems, um, and the Libre 3 seems to be working kind of comparable to the Dexcom. And I believe it's today, Dexcom now in the USA has an over the counter um, CGM available. The Stello, I think. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, and sadly that's like a controversial topic. Um, diabetics will complain that non-diabetics are getting CGMs, and I think it's ridiculous. I think more people need to be testing their blood sugar, not less. And it's something, 1 and 2 have at least prediabetes, so at least half the population has some blood sugar issues and could benefit from a CGM. And so, yeah, I think it's great that this over-the-counter version is out. It's like $89 for a month, so that's pretty reasonably priced. And
Yeah,
if you're somebody that's kind of borderline, even using something like that for a month would be really eye-opening to show you the
definitely.
effects of all the foods that you're eating, and maybe all it takes to kind of iron those things out.
Yeah, I think CGMs for me, it doesn't change what you do in your diet and lifestyle. That's the important thing. It doesn't change what the ideal human diet is. But I think they're useful in situations like that where someone is maybe pre-diabetic and they don't know it, and
Yeah,
seeing their glucose wakes them up
yeah,
in order to then do the right thing. So, like, I agree with you. I mean, even if it's just 1 month that someone tries it, to see that they're not having good control over their blood glucose, you don't have to
yeah.
keep doing it. That's all you need to know. And then you just eat properly after that, and things should settle down by themselves.
And you'll see things that are not diet related that are elevating glucose too, like stress and poor sleep.
Yeah,
And even one night of bad sleep, the human body needs like it needs 8 hours of sleep at night, and it's very commonly not achieved by most people. And yeah, it affects blood sugars for sure. And
definitely.
fixing that is I would say just as important as diet.
Yeah.
And I think sleep in general is not addressed at all. And I'll have many type 2 diabetic patients that change their diet and still have blood sugar problems, and we look into it, and either they have insomnia, or they have sleep apnea, or they have some sleep issue that's holding them back despite eating well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think diet and lifestyle are both just as important as each other, and one without the other is not that useful. You have to tick
Sure.
both boxes. So I'd like to finish off by putting you in a sort of hypothetical exercise. So imagine you've got someone on a standard Western diet, which I think obviously describes most people that are probably going to be watching this, and they have now been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I want you to imagine that you are the person taking care of them, and that particular person is going to do whatever you say. If money was no object, if motivation and commitment was no object, discipline was no object, what would you have them do to be as healthy as possible considering that diagnosis?
Yeah. So, and this is something I see quite a bit. I see a lot of newly diagnosed type 1 diabetics, and um, you know, I have the advantage that if someone's seeking me out, they've kind of already started going down that road, and I understand a lot of doctors don't have that. So if I was someone that you know was seeing someone that didn't have this insight and wasn't curious, I would first educate them. And when I sit down with any patient, a big part of what I do is educating them, because just telling someone what to do is one thing, but if you to have good compliance, if they're educated and they understand and they know why they're doing these things, it just makes things much more sustainable and actually work. So I would educate them on what a normal, healthy, insulin sensitive non-diabetics blood sugars look like. I would educate them on the effects of elevated blood sugars, even mildly elevated blood sugars. You know, the high end of the normal range there's increases in cardiovascular disease and cancer, and all the apathies that are associated with with diabetes,
Mm.
like retinopathy and nephropathy and
Yeah,
all these damages to our.
everything in the kind of metabolic sphere, I guess.
Yeah. And these things start occurring at the high end of the normal range. So not even into the diabetic range. And yeah, I would start, hey, look, this is why we're trying to avoid this. This is what a normal person that doesn't have these things looks like. This is what I want. This is why I want you to do that. And I think that initial education is huge. Otherwise, hey, do these things, it'll be healthy for you. Doesn't really sell it. And then once we're on the same page of, yes, I want to make these changes, I want to have normal blood sugars, then okay, let's let's start with diet, cutting all the carbs out, eating a protein focused diet, let's, even before the mealtime insulin that we talked about, which is really, really important. I work on their basal, their long acting fasted insulin first, because I want to have normal blood sugars in the background before we add a meal on top and deal with that spike. And it's important to separate those two things and work on them both. And yeah, that's how I approach every type one that I sit down with, and then they get results like me. And you know, folks do, if they've been a type one for a while, they'll feel so much better this way, and they start losing weight, and they have more energy and all of that. For a newly diagnosed person, they're since it's all new, they're going to have a less drastic approach, but they're going to see that their blood sugars are, are so much easier to control while they're doing this. And now with CGMs out there, it's instant feedback. When I started doing this, I was diagnosed in 2006. There was no CGM, so it was whenever you're testing your blood sugar, that's your blood sugar. You don't have the in between pieces, so there's a lot of missing data there. But now we can see everything, so there's no hiding those blood sugars. So if someone gets started on this and then they eat a high carb pizza, they're going to see that there's no hiding that. And yeah, that's kind of how I approach every type one that I sit down with. And it works, and we get results. And
Yeah.
yeah, this method is the solution to that roller coaster ride that is way too common in the type one world.
Yeah. So I think when they come to see you and you put that CGM on them as part of that education process to see their own level while they're understanding what a non-diabetics level should be, do you, at that point, when they're starting to use insulin, do you automatically get them onto a pump like yours, or do you teach them to do it manually first as a backup in case a future pump doesn't work?
I do both, and I think in general it's good for someone to start off with injections, just so they can learn the basics of managing. And
Yeah.
once they got a hang of it that way, I encourage pumps because they do have advantages, like the turning off when you're low, the having different basal rates minute by minute throughout the day if you needed. So they have a lot of advantages, but one can achieve these results with injections as well. So yeah, again, I think it's important to start initially with injections, and then if it works for somebody, some people don't want to wear something on their body, and
Sure.
I get it. I mean, it's my CGM is here. It's a lot smaller. It's very thin. This is it's not terrible, but it's a bit of a thing.
Yeah.
So some people just don't want that. I used to do jujitsu, and I know
Wow.
there are some people wearing this on parts of their body that doesn't get bashed too bad, and putting protective tape over it. But I've yet to try again since I've been using this. But yeah, if you were doing some kind of contact sport like that, and that might be an issue. Maybe a pump
Sure.
isn't for you, but yeah, you can achieve these results regardless.
Yeah. And in terms of, I know you mentioned a few brand names of insulin, and I think people would be interested to know when someone comes to you with a kind of, let's call it a standard issue insulin, what kind of brand names are we looking at? And when you come to the type that you feel is better for people on a more low carb, keto, carnivore diet, could you talk about that brand name and how you transition from one to the other?
Yeah. So the the insulin, the regular insulin, Novel is the brand name is Novolin R here in the USA, um, and and it's the generic regular insulin is everywhere. So how do they transition? Um, I they go right at it, and they start like anything. You start conservatively, start with a low dose, and look at the results after. And often, very commonly, you have to take your insulin before a meal, and what's called a pre-bolus, and anywhere from like 5 to 25 minutes before for some people, and it just gives the insulin a little bit of a head start. But yeah, no, I go have them start right away. Now they're used to with their rapid insulins. and to count carbs and take the dose based on how many grams of carbohydrates are in those foods. With the protein, it's a little different in that you don't really count the grams of protein in the particular food. You basically go by the weight of the whole protein food. So, we measure meat in in ounces here. So an 8-ounce steak would need so and so units of insulin. Half that would probably need half that amount of insulin. And so you go by the whole weight of the food, because it's not actually people think that they eat protein and then that protein is turning into sugar in their body, but that's not really what's happening. The blood sugar spike after you eat protein because of the digestive process. The protein slowly moving through your gut stimulates the glycogen from your liver to be created, and that's the spike that we're seeing. And so you're taking not to balance off the glucose that comes about. You're taking insulin kind of hormonally to stop that spike from even happening. And so and it's really because it's from the stimulation of the digestive process. That's why we measure the whole food and the weight of that food to gauge the dose. And that's straight from Dr. Bernstein's method. And that's something I have every new type 1 do, is read his book. It's called the Diabetes Solution. And there's a really good documentary too, Diabetes Solution. And it's all about folks following his method, and he's interviewed in it as well. And I'm interviewed in it too. So it's a good watch, and it's really well done. Yeah. And that's actually a really good place for anyone to start, even before they read the book. Watch this documentary and just get an idea of what people out there are doing that you're not going to hear about from your normal endocrinologist.
And when you say you're going to measure the food, let's say you got a steak, do you mean measure it before it's cooked, so raw, or after it's been cooked?
After it's cooked, and
Okay.
it's not as folks are used to, when they're dosing for carbs, like really really meticulously measuring how much carbs and counting every little piece of food that's in their meal, and then dosing it, which never works. It's always still a big roller coaster ride. But the regular insulin and the protein is much more forgiving, and it's much smaller doses too. So that's the thing. My blood sugars aren't always perfect. I'll have a spike or a drop sometimes, but it's a very mild spike. It's a very mild drop that's easily corrected. It's like lower highs and higher lows, basically, when you're using this method. So it's much easier to match up that mild dose with the protein, and it's much more forgiving too.
Okay. And what about people who are coming to you on a standard Western diet, so which I guess is probably going to be quite a lot of your patients, but who are willing to transition, and during that transition period, they're cutting down on the carbs, but they're having a mixed meal. So they might have steak, but then they're having a little bit of roast potatoes on their journey to having no potatoes eventually. Because you've got a cooked protein, which obviously you can weigh, but then you've got a certain mass of carbs. How do you calculate the insulin in a mixed meal like that?
Yeah, I mean, somebody doing that, which I would discourage them from doing that. But if they would, then they would have to dose for the carbs using the traditional conventional method. I find in general in life, with a lot of things, it's easier to do something 100% than it is to do 99%. So if you're going to allow yourself to have little bits, you have a little bit of potatoes in this meal, it's gonna snowball and become more and more, and a cheat meal turns into a cheat day, turns into cheat week, turns into you're off the diet. These days too, it's never been easier to cut out carbs and find really good replacements for all the kind of comfort foods out there. So it's easier than people think to just get off that stuff and stick to the low carb foods.
Fantastic. And I mean, could you just tell us whereabouts physically in the US you're based to see your patients?
Yep, I'm in Connecticut, and
Connecticut.
that's Northeast USA. I do see patients remotely, even around the world. They can go on my website and read more about that. Drattar.com, DRATTAR.com.
Fantastic. I'll put a link to that in the description below. I actually get quite a few patients in the US as well who
Oh,
unfortunately say
nice.
they want to see me in person, but obviously they can't
Huh.
because I'm in London. So I think it'll be a good referral for me to send them to
Yeah,
you. Actually, that'll be good.
nice.
So Ryan, it's been fantastic. I think it's been brilliant for me to learn a lot of new things as well. And hopefully, I think a lot of type 1 diabetics watching this will have a much better hope that isn't false, that is a true hope to see someone like yourself with such brilliant HbA1c figures. And also to understand that Dr. Bernstein is now 90 with a type 1 diabetes diagnosis as well. So I'm sure this video is going to help so many people and be completely invaluable. So I want to thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you.
It's
Thank
been brilliant.
thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm really appreciative to hear your enthusiasm and curiosity about all this stuff. And yeah, I wish there was more of that out there.
Thank you. Thank you. If you're ever in London, I'll take you for a steak.
Thank you. Thank you.